Welcome to this week's episode of What's at Stake. I'm your host, Ylan Mui, a managing director at Penta, and today I'm joined by two of my Penta colleagues in Europe to talk about tariffs, trade, and their implications for foreign governments and corporate executives. Stuart Harbinson is a senior advisor to Penta on international trade policy, and he previously represented Hong Kong in the World Trade Organization. We're also joined by Rory O'Donnell, a partner in our Brussels office, who works on international agriculture, food, and trade issues. Rory has over 30 years of experience working in the UK civil service, focused on agri-food, trade, and Brexit issues. Stuart and Rory, you've seen a lot. There's a lot happening now, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
To be here.
Fantastic. Well, we're really glad to have you on because in the past week or so, we started to see the first rumblings of at least trade tensions, if not a full-out global trade war. President Trump threatening 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada, then delaying them at the last minute for about a month. He did move forward with a 10% tariff on Chinese imports. Now there's talk that the EU could be next. Stuart, I'd like to start with you to just get a sense of from where you sit in France, what is the rationale behind these moves? Is there an end game here?
Well, thanks very much, Ylan, and it's great to be here with you today. It's a very good question. I don't say that I have a crystal ball to be able to predict what the end game is, but I think you can discern maybe three motives for the current actions that are taking place. I think, first of all, there's a feeling of the US being treated unfairly, a lack of reciprocity by its trading partners, resulting in trade deficits, which President Trump clearly doesn't like at all. Secondly, there's a revenue-raising rationale, which we hear about from time to time, that maybe President Trump wants to switch from taxation revenue, internal revenue, to external revenue in the form of tariffs. That's an interesting one because if you choke off trade too much through too high tariffs, then your revenue is also going to suffer. So there's clearly a balance that would need to be struck there. And then thirdly, I think it's kind of leverage on non-trade issues as well. We saw that most clearly with Mexico and Canada and the points which President Trump was making about migration and drugs. So I think these are the three things that are behind it, but they apply in a different kind of combination to different situations. So, for example, the lack of fairness or lack of reciprocity, that would apply to the EU and China, perhaps, whereas the leverage would apply more to Mexico and Canada. But these are not kind of distinct, discrete categories of issues. I think in each situation there's a mixture.
Yeah, I want to come back to eventually the point that you made around the use of tariffs as leverage on potentially non-economic issues. But I think one of the things that was really striking and maybe has a lot of companies worried is that the tariffs on China have been well communicated since his first run for office, and might be even understandable in terms of the geopolitical context in which they're being applied. But to go after our allies seems like a different situation entirely, Stuart.
Well, that is true, and one of the points that's occurred to me thinking about this is that the US has a very good, strong trading relationship with many countries. If you were thinking about it from a UK perspective, I mean, Rory perhaps ought to be commenting on this more than I am, but it would be not unreasonable, I think, for any country which was thinking of having a trade agreement with the US, or which already had an agreement with the US, such as, for example, other US allies like Korea and Japan. It would be not unreasonable for them to think, well, is this agreement really worth it? Because, I'm going to go through a lot of pain, or I have gone through a lot of pain in order to make sacrifices to get this agreement with the US, and now suddenly it's not no longer applicable in practice through the effect of additional tariffs, which are completely contrary to what's in the trade agreement or in the US's WTO commitments.
Rory, what's the perspective in the EU?
So the EU have been thinking about it. I mean, President Trump in the campaign talked about tariffs. I mean, China featured higher than the EU, although in the last week or so, he's described the EU-US trade deficit as an atrocity, I think. So we feel strongly about it. And in some ways, you can see why. There is a significant trade balance in favour of the EU for goods. But of course, there's a significant trade balance in favour of the US in terms of services. So the EU are thinking about it. They are worried about it. They're worried about it for a number of reasons. One, tariffs are bad for trade. It increased costs around, on at various angles, and that's bad for economic growth, which is a priority for the EU. They're worried about it, I think, from a geopolitical perspective, because in a world where there is geopolitical problems, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the situation in the Middle East, whether it is what ambitions China might have in terms of Taiwan and other things, having allies in trade disputes, it's bad for the economy, but it looks bad as well. So I think they're worried about that. What will they do? I'm sure they're actively talking about what they'll do. I would expect they will respond in the same way as Canada did very quickly. I would imagine the EU are looking at, well, how could they respond if tariffs are put in place? And in many trade disputes, the retaliation is very targeted. So they look at Republican states. The last time we were having trouble between the EU and the US, they looked at Harley Davidsons and denim and Florida orange juice and bourbon. And I guess they're looking at those again. But I think they are also looking at, are there ways in which they could maybe avoid this or calm this down? And one of the issues that we think President Trump is worried about is how much the European countries pay towards defence. So I think they'll be looking at that, and defence is a much bigger priority for the current Commission than it has been previously. So there'll be a combination of, is there a way we can negotiate our way out of this problem? But if we can't, well, then we have to have a robust response. I think that's where the EU is.
Don't tax our bourbon, right? That'll be one that gets folks upset here in the U.S. for sure. But to be serious here for a minute, I think you both have brought up a really important point. One, Rory, you mentioned the idea of tariffs as potentially a mechanism to get countries to pay more into NATO. Stuart, you also mentioned sort of the leverage of tariffs around potentially social policy issues. I think that one of the things that might be different about the way the Trump administration approaches these tools is that they are fundamentally, economic levers that he's using in other policy areas: defense, immigration, health, if you will. When you think about the fentanyl crisis, what do you make of that, and what kind of challenge does that pose when elected officials of other governments are thinking about how to respond?
Yeah, I mean that's also an extremely good question. I suppose in years gone by, decades gone by, trade was considered to be a slightly separate sort of issue that could be isolated from other issues. Trade has, let's face it, trade has prospered. You can argue that the distributional effects have not been very well handled in some cases, but in terms of general prosperity and development for developing countries and things like that, trade has been really good. But there is increasingly a tendency, I think, particularly amongst developed countries, particularly the European Union, but now also the United States, to link trade with a whole range of other issues. And whether you like it or not, I think this is a reality that is going to have to be factored in to countries when they consider their trading rights and trading obligations. So that's really important. I think one downside of this is that, we've got a set of trade rules under the World Trade Organization, which by and large have been adhered to by nearly all countries, especially by the US in the past. And it doesn't matter so much what the rules are in the WTO, but it's the fact that they provide certainty and predictability. This is really key for businesses. I've lost count of the number of businesses have said that, the name of the game is knowing what the rules are and knowing that you can rely on the next time you export or import, the rules will be like that. But now we're in completely different territory, and it worries me that this could have serious economic impacts in terms of adversely affecting trade and growth eventually, because businessmen will be wondering what's going to happen when they next do a shipment or next receive a shipment. So this is a concern that we're in a new ball game now.
I very much agree with that last point. I think what business wants is certainty and consistency, and they can make commercial decisions that deal with whatever the rules are, as long as the rules are applied. I worked on Brexit for a number of years when the UK left the EU, and the biggest, there are all sorts of issues with that, but we're not here to talk about that today. But one of the things that business said on both sides of the channel was that the uncertainty, both the political uncertainty given the problems in the UK government at the time caused by Brexit, but also the uncertainty about what border checks there might be, what paperwork might be needed for people sending goods in either direction. That's what caused the real impact on those. They would have liked as little regulation as possible, but what they wanted more than anything was certainty about what the regulation was. So if there was something, it would apply for every shipment and they knew what to do. And there were several years where that didn't happen, and that has had an impact and an ongoing impact on the UK economy. So I think certainty is important for business. And I think growth is a big priority for the UK. It is a big priority for the EU. Ursula von der Leyen made a speech last week. In classic Euro speak, the competitiveness compass, not totally sure what it means, but it basically, it basically is around how can the EU get more competitive. And a trade dispute with the US is not on the list of any of the measures that they want. So I think there are issues there as well. It is through certainty and good trading that you can start to look at growth strategies. In a world where things change every other day or every other week, that makes it very hard.
Yeah, and I also think that by tying the tariffs to these sort of nebulous non-economic goals makes it that much more difficult to understand when might the tariffs be lifted, right? When is the fentanyl crisis abated enough that Trump would feel that, okay, we don't need to have these tariffs on Mexico anymore? Or how much is enough to fund NATO before Trump is willing to back down? We did see the sort of 12-hour trade war, I guess, if it was, with Colombia, was very discreet. Take this plane of migrants and then we will lift the tariff. So that was a very clear beginning and a very clear end. But some of the conditions that seem to be attached to the tariffs make it very difficult to understand when they might ever be lifted, if at all. Stuart, overall, it seems like part of the perception then might be that because of all of this volatility, the U.S. may not be as reliable of a trading partner as it was previously. And that could create openings for other countries like China to exercise some soft power. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think China would probably see that as an opportunity. How well that might be received throughout the world is perhaps another question. But clearly, it has been the case that the US has stepped back from its traditional leadership role in terms of international trade policy, and this has created a vacuum, which I think China would be anxious to fill. And I noted that China's response to the latest round of tariffs was reasonably downplayed. They didn't go overboard in terms of retaliation. I think clearly they are prepared to retaliate further if they think it's necessary, but they've been reasonably restrained so far. And what they've done is they've started a case at the World Trade Organization accusing the US of breaking its international obligations. I mean, that won't go anywhere because the WTO's dispute settlement system is hamstrung at present. But I think it's an indication that China is saying we're playing by the rules and we're prepared to back the rules-based international trading system in this situation. And that is a form of leadership, I think, by China.
It is interesting, though, because the EU and China are also in a bit of a trade dispute. Probably a more reasonable one in that the EU have imposed significant tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China because they think there's subsidizing and stuff going on that makes them artificially cheap and therefore freezing out European electric vehicle manufacturers. And as a result, China have put in place, I think, tariffs on brandy and cognac from the EU currently and are looking at pork and dairy. But that's kind of what the mechanism is for. We think you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. We're going to take action to try and address it. They say we're not. We'll take action in retaliation to what you've done. And it's still a trade dispute and it's still bad overall, but it's within the boundaries that we're used to. I think what's going on at the minute with President Trump is slightly outside that. But, the other risk is that potentially China gets let off the hook a bit because there are questions around how industry works in China and whether there's cross subsidies and artificially lower prices for a whole range of goods. But there's a risk that somehow people think, well, that's better behavior, and therefore they stop addressing that because do you want to be having trade disputes in every direction? So I just think that those sort of implications will take time to evolve, and we see. I mean, we have seen already that the Colombia thing didn't last very long. The Canadian-Mexican things have been delayed. Let's see if they come back. I guess they will, but you never know. They may come back in a different form. So it may be that we have a flurry for a month or two or three, and then things settle as end games start to appear. But if they don't, I think it's quite a risky world we're moving into.
Just to add to what Rory's said, it's interesting that when the United States hamstrung the WTO's dispute settlement system by refusing to appoint new members to the appellate body, which is the final sort of so-called court in the WTO, the EU led an effort to plug the gap with a sort of interim mechanism which replicated that sort of quasi-judicial process. And China signed up to that. So that both the EU and China are members of this interim mechanism, which is a binding mechanism. So one would hope that any disputes between the EU and China would go through this process and have a kind of rules-based outcome. That would be very good from a world trading point of view, I think, if that were to happen. But of course, these things don't happen quickly, and that would take quite a long time to emerge.
It seems that the one thing that the administration may have taken to heart was the immediate reaction of the markets to the threatened tariffs. Markets in the U.S. were down dramatically when President Trump first announced that he would be imposing those 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And so I wonder about the economic reaction. Things take so long and can't even move forward under the WTO. Maybe the economic impact could be one that gives the administration pause as they think about whether and how to move forward with some of these policy moves. The Tax Foundation estimates that tariffs could reduce long-run GDP by 0.2% and cost about 140,000 jobs in the U.S. What do you see as the economic or potential economic impact in both Europe and China?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the big issues during the U.S. election last year was around inflation, And I think it may take a little while. Businesses have to decide, as you said yourself earlier. Businesses have to decide: do they pass on the increased costs as a result of tariffs, or do they try and absorb it? But whichever route they take, if they try and absorb it, they make less profit. So that's a problem. If they pass it on, then you've got an issue with inflation, and agri-food and drink sector often are seen as ones, but it goes beyond that. So you could end up in a situation where you're causing inflation, and of course, if the dispute is with the EU, then the same happens this side of the pond as well. So you end up in a world where people are striving for growth, but instead they find they're dealing with inflation and increased costs and increased barriers to business, frankly. So in a simplistic way, I think quite quickly that's a pattern that we can see, and I think it's quite hard to find a way that you avoid that, because I mean tariffs are another form of tax. I mean it's a cost, and it works its way through the system in some way or the other, which is why really what you have to try and do is see, is there a way we can solve the problem? So is there a clarity of the end point that President Trump would like to get to, and can the EU find a way of accommodating that, or Canada or Mexico or whoever else he chooses to put the tariffs on? But I think that relatively quickly, inflation could become an issue for both Europe and for the US.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that, Rory. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, I'm not an expert on the US scene, Ylan, but I mean, if you take the Mexico Canada issue, I mean, I think President Trump's declared an emergency under this International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And you said earlier, which I also rang a bell with me, it's fine to declare an emergency, but how can you say when an emergency is over? I mean, it's a very grey area. And in the US, I'm not sure whether this would result in a court challenge, or whether it would be some sort of action by Congress. But the longer it goes on, the more difficult it will be. And it could be, as Rory said, that it's the markets and the economic situation that actually has the effect first, before all of these things can be worked through. So, I mean, I think we have to watch that space with great vigilance.
Yeah, we already saw this week. We're recording this on Friday, February 7th, and I want to make a note of that, because as we've been seeing, the news and the actions have been moving at a fast and furious pace. But this week we did hear from several central bank officials in the US saying that, they're watching the moves on tariffs because it could stoke inflation, maybe even staying the Fed's hand as it considers, what its policy response should be, holding interest rates steady as opposed to cutting them, because certainly if we're seeing higher prices down the line, rates would have to stay higher to combat that inflation. I want to ask a sort of, we've been talking about the sort of negative impacts of tariffs on businesses, on the economy, on foreign policy. But I do want to ask a little bit of a counterintuitive question, which is, are there any sectors in Europe or China that might actually benefit from tariffs from the US, or that might actually see a business opportunity in the trade war?
Well, I don't know about that. I think that is a bit counterintuitive, but I think what's been happening is that Chinese companies have been seeing this coming for a while, and have been moving out of China to Southeast Asia, to Mexico, of course, as well. And so you have a kind of like a diaspora of Chinese companies. And what is interesting is whether these will turn out to be new opportunities, or whether the effect of the tariffs will be broadened out to cover countries like, for example, Vietnam, which has a very large trade surplus with the US now, in part because of investment from China. So I think that is something that needs to be watched. And I think, it will affect perhaps also the judgment of potential host countries for investments from China. whether this is, going to be beneficial for their economies in the long run, or whether it's just going to put them in the crosshairs of the US. So this is another moving target, but clearly Mexico is already in the crosshairs, and there could be other contenders, coming up in that regard as well.
It's quite interesting, and it's hard to think. So for example, if we'll go back to bourbon in the US. If you're a bourbon producer in the US, and suddenly there's a 25% tariff on Scotch whiskey, or even better, Irish whiskey, and French brandy, well then you may well sell more bourbon because the imports become too expensive. So there could be a short-term gain from a bit of market displacement. But that would be, I think, that's fairly short term. But and of course you would probably lose a chunk of your export market. So if you're a domestic bourbon producer who doesn't export, there could be something in it for you. The other area where President Trump is really unhappy is he doesn't like the fact that Europeans don't buy American cars, but Americans do buy European cars. But I'm not sure tariffs is going to solve that problem. So it's hard to say. We don't want to sound so negative about it, but in the end, trade is good and has been good for a long time, and helps economies and helps relations between countries. And tariffs make trade harder. So there may be some niche areas where people feel a bit better about it, but overall, I think the collective loses as a result of trade wars, I think.
Maybe I can just add there, Ylan, that in the first trade war under the Trump's first term, China in retaliating put in a lot of duties particularly on US agricultural exports. And there were countries that benefited from that, particularly Brazil and Argentina, in terms of soybeans and things like that. And I think the American agricultural community might be a little bit worried that they're going to be targeted again in terms of retaliation, and that other agricultural exporting countries will be able to take their place and get markets which they might struggle to win back in due course. So, Rory, this is maybe also your area, but I think that did happen. Brazil and Argentina particularly benefited from Chinese retaliation against the first round of Trump tariffs.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it gets into a sort of wider question of, net is are things better? So Brazil got a boost, and American producers lost. It's not quite a zero-sum game, but you're not far away from it. So I think in the end, and I think Stuart's point around it's a temporary measure that cost you a market, but it's much harder to get a market back once you've lost it. I think that's the problem. So we've come back round into the slightly more negative route, but hey,
no. Well, it's hard to find that bright spot. So I guess final question, Rory and Stuart, when you're talking to businesses, when you're talking to corporate executives, and helping them navigate through all of this uncertainty and the volatility and the challenges we've been talking about, is there one piece of advice that you're able to give them, I guess, other than pour out a glass of bourbon or a glass of scotch, as the case may be, and hope for the best?
So I had a conversation earlier this week with a colleague who runs the Spirits Trade Association. We're back to drink again. This is terrible. The weekend's
it's a great podcast. They love it.
But so interestingly, the relationship between the EU spirit sector sell a lot into the US and vice versa. So one of the things I was talking to this guy about was, have they made contact across the pond? So if maybe in a world that each other's respective market is so important to them, maybe a combined effort on the side of talking to the EU authorities to say, look, don't be doing anything about bourbon, and to the US authorities saying, can we leave the spirit drink sector out of these disputes and put tariffs somewhere else? So I think there's something in that, and there will be a number of sectors where there is a mutual benefit to trying to avoid them getting dragged in. So we're offering a bit of advice around there. The other advice I'm giving companies in Europe is, talk to the decision makers. I mean, the Commission will be looking at what it might do in under various different scenarios. So be in there, be listening to them, be giving them your view, be giving them good data that would enable them to work out which sectors might work better and which may not. And I think that's important. I mean, in a world where we don't quite know what's going to happen and when, that shouldn't be an excuse not to be talking to the people who will be making the decisions in the end. And I mean, our advice is to be getting in front of commissioners, parliamentarians, others to make their points clear.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Rory's just said. I think that's very interesting about alliances, international commercial alliances, as it were. It's a very, very, very good point. I think the only thing I can add is that try to maybe activate the importing communities, because these are big players, retail consortia and people like that, and they employ a lot of people, so they do have a voice which they should make heard, as also users of intermediate inputs, because a lot of things are just made globally or internationally now, and you can't make something exclusively from within your own country or your own economy. So intermediate trade is really, really important. So just those points to think about, and stay as flexible as you possibly can. Of course, it's harder in some industries and trades than others, but to the extent that you can, be as flexible as possible.
All great advice. And I'll say that we're talking to clients here too about the importance of coalitions. No one company wants to be the subject of that tweet or that truth on Truth Social, right? But this is the importance of trade groups and the importance of sort of industry allies in making the case against tariffs. So Stuart and Rory, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. Really appreciate the conversation. Depending on how things go, we might have to have you back again, maybe in the not too distant future, to talk on the latest developments, but we really appreciate it. To our listeners, please remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and follow us on X at Penta GRP and on LinkedIn at Penta Group. I'm your host, Ylan, and as always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake.